It is indeed a pleasure to be here for the Thomas Berry Lecture. I first encountered this famous book when I was a graduate student at Chicago. I don't think any economic historian really gets very far without encountering the major data sources that form the heart of our discipline. I'll figure this out at some point. That seems to work. And so I've kind of come full circle, I guess, to the home office, you might say, of where Professor Berry did much of his work and spent his career. So it is a pleasure. Plus, he wrote in Cincinnati, and I'm from Ohio, so yet another. I suppose we could go on and make other connections, but there's a lot to discuss. And what I have for you is really work that I first got into before I finished my dissertation. I started working on heights and had the interdisciplinary gene, if you want to call it that, way back then, blending economics, history, demography, human biology, anthropology, and have been doing so throughout my career. And so this is a story this evening of working with evidence that took many, many years for me to compile. And we do have some new results. So this work is unpublished, and I'll explain what I'm intending to do with this in coming years, or the next year or two anyway. So there is a question of how to measure the standard of living of slaves, or, as Eric mentioned, Plains Indians or any other group for which we don't have wages, income, wealth, or normal life expectancy kinds of stuff that all are important measures of social performance. Of course, we'd love to have these, but they're simply not available. And so what can we say about the lives of slaves? Their claims on many points of view represented about how they lived. So we're here to talk about health and nutrition, a very important dimension. I ask my students from time to time when we introduce this subject, what's important to you? And I ask them, if you had to be born to parents at random in some other country in the world, you didn't know who your parents were going to be, and you could know two things about that country, what would you want to know? And it usually comes down to health and material things and, well, freedom of various, on and on. But health and material things are always important. Health is on everybody's list. So it is a very important aspect of the quality of life. So I'll talk a little bit about heights and the methodology. I'm not presuming you know much about working with these data, though I think some in the audience do. I'll speak briefly about the slave manifest from which I got the data I'll be working with, and then go into some implications of what these data show us about the management of slave plantations. Okay, so here's a graph that shows how people grow from birth to adulthood. We have measured up here growth velocity in centimeters. So you can see in the first year of life, well, little babies are not little very long. They grow very quickly, about 10, 11, 12 inches the first year. And then this growth curve, velocity curve declines irregularly, especially if you look at a single person. This is an average for the United States from National Center for Health Statistics data. And then there's this phenomena called the adolescent growth spurt, which many of us remember fondly as a time when you could eat as much as you wanted and especially never gain weight, especially if you're playing sports. And problem is you retain those habits long after you finish growing physically, and then you grow outward instead of upward. But there's a huge demand for calories in your teens or during this growth spurt. And this profile is similar for men and women. There are some slight differences. Girls go through the adolescent growth spurt earlier than boys, a couple of years. And for a period of time, girls are taller than boys as a result of this. In the 6th, 7th grade, I remember watching our kids who were 1 year apart at choir presentations in 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th grade. And all of a sudden, in the 6th grade, the girls are a little taller, 7th grade, and they're more physically coordinated and stronger and better soccer players. And some say boys never get over this period. I don't know whether that's true or not, but then the girls slow down because they're on the downslope of the adolescent growth spurt, and the boys are beginning theirs. And so by the time freshmen high school, boys are beginning to overtake. By sophomore, they're there. And then they end up 4.5 to 5 inches taller than girls because they grow 2 years longer at pre-adolescent rates, 2 years longer to mature. And that's what it comes down to. And this is the same pattern you see around the world. So now this pattern you see here can be disturbed by dietary insufficiency, disease, or hard work. You think of the body as a biological machine, what we are. We're an engine. We consume fuel, calories, vitamins, minerals, micronutrients, so forth. And it takes about 12 to 1,400 calories to pump the blood and to stay warm in bed. So our engines are always on. They're always running, okay? And then, though, if you put the pedal to the metal to this engine and start working hard, you consume a lot more fuel, a lot more calories. How much can you consume? The most arduous, sustained activity I know about is running the Iditarod dog race from Anchorage to Nome, Alaska. And there, the people, and the dogs too, but the people expend about 10,000 calories a day. Absolutely enormous. And you think of, I know many of you work out in this room, I can see you're fit. When you're on one of those machines, a good workout is, if an hour, you burn 600 calories, okay? Something like that, right? 4, 5, 6, 700 calories is a good workout. Well, to do 10,000, of course, they're running 20 hours a day, and it's cold, and they have packs on, and they're managing this big sled. You have to be extraordinarily fit, and the people who win this race begin a little bit overweight because they lose 20 pounds in a couple of weeks. So you can't keep that up forever. It's hard to consume 10,000 calories a day. And the dogs similarly have to be very, very fit in order to survive that race. So the point is you can starve on 5,000 or 6,000 calories a day. Hard as that is to believe, I think most of us would explode on such a diet. We couldn't consume that much as you might like to. It's simply not possible. So that, how hard you work affects how much fuel you need and therefore how much you can grow. Because growth has a low priority on this biological machine. It had to be that way. I mean, we evolved over hundreds of thousands, say millions of years. We didn't have 3 square meals a day, okay? We had fat reserves, children gave up on growth. You just stopped growing during a famine. This is very well documented. If you look at children during the siege of Leningrad and so on and so forth have been measured, they didn't grow. Or grew very, very little. And then there's a phenomenon called catch-up growth. You get back on target if the period of deprivation wasn't too long or too severe and good times resume. So you can make up for lost growth, which is an important part of my story here tonight. The other thing is disease. Disease claims fuel. Gastrointestinal diseases particularly claim fuel. But respiratory diseases, all kinds of diseases. You raise body temperature, you're fighting infection, that's nutrition that could have gone into growth. So we really think of height as one's history of net nutrition from birth, really from conception, up to the time up to the age at which you're measured. It's a measure of net nutrition. And that, in some sense, it makes heights a terrific summary measure of human welfare with respect to health, because it brings together all these different variables into a single number, how tall you are. But it makes it very hard to analyze, to get data on diet, work, exposure to disease, and so on. And it's particularly difficult to study the heights of adults, because you have 20 years of history in getting to adult height, say, 22 years of history, and a lot of things could have gone on in that period of time, and there could be interactions. It's very, very difficult. So I have a proposed solution to that problem with these very unusual slave manifest data. So how do heights compare to other measures of social performance that we know and love, one of which is per capita GDP, or gross domestic product, which is measured here. And what we have is about 18 countries for which there have been national height studies conducted in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And the heights of 12-year-old boys are here. You get a similar graph for girls or for adults. Doesn't make a lot of difference. And you notice this this is a log function superimposed on those dots. And the R square, log of height, and log of per capita GDP and height is about 0.85, okay? And of course, it's nonlinear. Why? Well, if you're really, really poor and you get some additional income, you spend it on food. Okay, these people are starving. They work hard. They have heavy disease loads. Their growth is impaired by that fact. And as their income grows more and more, well, the return, the extra oomph to height you get out of more income slows down. What economists call diminishing marginal returns to income on height. In fact, it has to be nonlinear. If it was linear, what would be true? Bill Gates' kids would be 20 feet tall, right? You know, once you reach something close to an ideal environment, that's it. You don't grow anymore. So heights, then, are a good measure of deprivation, but they're not a very good measure of opulence. Okay? So distinguishing degrees of opulence using heights is not that. But I still think there are groups at risk in the United States for whom heights could be very usefully employed. Another measure we use a lot is life expectancy at birth. And this is the same set of countries as for the income, very same ones. And here we have a linear relationship, fairly tight, where life expectancy varies from about 50 to 75 or 78 years. I don't know, maybe it's nonlinear at lower. At some point it could be nonlinear, but it's linear here. So the point is, heights tell you things or line up in good ways with other measures of standard living that we use all the time. Now, here, getting to, that's all background. The talk at hand here deals with the health of slaves, which are hard to study because we lack records on wages and wealth and so on. But we have lots of data on heights. Why so? It's because the law for the abolition of the slave trade passed by Congress in 1807 became effective January 1st, 1808. And that law allowed the coastwise trade, the westward movement of slaves, to continue if the cargo was described by name, age, height, sex, and color at the port of origin. And then when duplicate manifests were prepared by the ship captain at the port of origin and taken, one copy was kept at the port of origin, the other taken by the captain, delivered to the collector. These are essentially treasury records at the port of destination, who compared the cargo with the manifest. And if they agreed, then it could be established these slaves were not smuggled in from Africa. Okay? So it's for identification purposes. So here's one of these manifests on the steamboat Lady of the Lake, going from to the port of New Orleans from Mobile, I guess. So it lists first names only of slaves, sex, age, height in feet and inches, class is essentially color, and the name of the ship or the owner. And here's the back page showing signatures and so on. Okay? And so there are about 30,000 of these in the National Archives. And I've coded them all. Not personally, but a lot of hardworking research assistants at The Ohio State University mainly did this. I got some. It just became so labor intensive working in Washington. I got about 60 reels of microfilm from New Orleans. The New Orleans Historical Society filmed a whole bunch pertaining to that city, and we finished up the collection there. So this is about 145,000 individuals, 30,000 manifests. Most, I'll show you a graph on distribution over time. But here's a map of the US just to acquaint you with the slave trade. The slaves, of course, were part of the westward movement, and large numbers of slaves that went around the manifests. And I figure the manifests maybe have 20 or 25% of all slaves who move west. A lot went overland. But so they're originating here and here and even down into here and moving west. Over time, the ports of origin increasingly go to the southwest and the west. So, in this sample, 146,148 individuals. Most are after 1820. There's almost none prior to 1814. The big outflow was in the late 40s and the early 50s in also the 1820s and the 1830s. This lines up well with other historical documents we know about the westward movement. So here are the heights of the slaves by age and sex. Here's for males. I have on the next slide that for females. And this is what becomes peculiar about the data. I've grouped them by age categories. And what these numbers in blue show are the percentiles these slaves at those ages achieved on average relative to modern height standards. You all know what a percentile is. If you're at the 50th percentile, that's the median. Okay? That's average, roughly. But you've all taken, what, SAT scores, ATC, you know all about percentiles. And if you're at the 99th percentile, it means 99 out of 100 individuals didn't do as well as you did on the exam, and so on. Okay? And if you're at the 5th percentile, well, we won't go there. But here, we're below the 1st percentile. The little children are incredibly small. Actually, among the smallest children ever measured. There are some in very poor developing countries of similar height and some historical populations, some slaves, some not, that are down below the 1st percentile. But these children are 5 to 6 inches below modern height standards. So if they were taken into a modern pediatrician's office, the typical slave would think was abused, would be cause for alarm. They're so small and unhealthy. Yet, here's the other thing. They caught up. The adult men were just about 2 inches below modern height standards, and the adult women only 1.3. And they were similarly small. Okay? So they're small under age 10 to 12, and then there's this big spurt where they catch up. They're not growing like the people in that chart I showed you, okay? They don't have rapid growth in early childhood. This population is different. In fact, if you compare this pattern of growth with that in developing countries or historical settings where you have data on children and adults, there's typically a very high correlation between the percentiles achieved by children and by adults in a given society. If the children are small, the adults are small. If the children are tall, the adults are tall. There's kind of a sharing of resources across ages, nutritional resources, but not here. So, just taking this, going back to the debates over slavery, what was slavery, what was the slave diet like? What was the slave standard of living? What was their health like? Well, it was very poor for the children and quite good for adults. And that's not predicted by the literature. That's generally not part of the story of American slavery. And by the way, in the Caribbean, the slave children are small, not quite this small, about the same though, and the adults don't catch up. Another story that I may come back to. Why so? And I have some hypotheses or explanations. So that's different. But this much catch-up is almost unprecedented in the historical record, but we know it's biologically possible. How so? Look at children adopted from poor developing countries into the United States. They catch up too. A lot. Especially if they get here early enough, before they're teenagers. Okay? They can catch up. The human body is enormously resilient. We can recover from a lot of abuse and bounce back, at least with respect to physical growth. As an anecdote on that, I have a good friend who teaches at the University of California at Berkeley, she and her partner adopted a little boy from Russia when he was a few months old, and he arrived well below the 5th percentile, and he's now at the 95th. Okay? A lot of catch-up. So it can be done. This is not biologically impossible. Okay? Well, the question is why? Why this pattern of growth right here? It's different from what's observed in the historical record. It's different from what's observed around the world in countries today. Did slavery do this in some way? What's the rate of return? Was this profitable to do this? And how would you investigate the question, was it profitable? How would you get an answer to that question? I've looked into that in this work, and one of the explanations, there's several problems these young slave children had. Many of them were born of very low birth weight for various reasons. There was a very short period of breastfeeding for most of them. Mothers were back in the field picking cotton within 2 or 3 months after birth, and then the children are fed contaminated food with contaminated utensils. So they're getting gastrointestinal diseases and they're getting dehydrated. And after that, they have a very low protein diet because the records, the instructions to overseers that I've read, and letters to the editor by plantation owners to Southern agricultural journals mention meat is reserved for working slaves. And they knew that slaves could not produce a full good day of work without the protein that comes from the meat. And we know protein is crucial for growth. Studies have been done by INCAP in Guatemala, Central America on that. You couldn't do such a study today because we know protein is important for growth. But they randomized who got within the family protein supplements and who didn't. And the children who got the protein supplements grew a lot faster than the ones who didn't. And they're in the same household. And this study was done in many different villages. And so surely protein deficit aggravated this. So the way I calculated the rate of return is presume a 50% protein deficit, and I've done sensitivity analysis on this, but the point is, and you know the protein would have come from pork. We know from Western prices and other Cincinnati prices on pork, this is coming full circle, what a pound of pork cost, and we know what the protein content was, and what it would have cost to bring that diet up to minimum standards for protein as established today. And we can cost that out, and then we assume the children would have been of modern height standards, no deficits here, and what we know what an inch of height was worth. Slaves, elasticity of a slave an inch taller was worth 1.4% more. That's the payoff to an inch of height. Okay. Turns out the rate of return on that investment is negative. It's absolutely startling. And if you assume mortality rates would have fallen in half as a result of the better nutrition, it surely would have gone down. If it fell in half, the rate of return is only about 3%. And as I say, I've done sensitivity analysis, making various assumptions about protein deficits and on and on and on. And within a wide range of assumptions, it's still not a competitive rate of return. And so what it turns out is it was profitable. In a way, that's a very disturbing result. On the other hand, maybe it isn't. It depends on what you think. It may be we can ask ourselves, you know, and what's even more puzzling from an economist's point of view is the owners of these slaves could realize the rewards of all these early nutrition investments. You see, it's not like they're could go off and work for some other firm. You know, if they're taller, they're worth more. There's full 100% recovery of the investment, and they still didn't do it. You can get into arguments, well, well-nourished children require more care. Well, that's probably true. They'll run around the plantation and get into mischief and so on and so forth. And they wanted docile children. And we know from reports in developing countries, poorly nourished children are much more docile, less active than well-nourished ones. So that could be an explanation. But then we ask, well, what does it say about capitalism? And do you want capitalism raising our children? And I guess the answer is no. I mean, we've all had tremendous gifts from our parents in raising us up, not because we were profitable, but because we were loved. Okay, is really what it comes down to. It's very important to get that perspective. But that same connection wasn't there, you see, between the slave owner and the slave child, as it is between parent and child. That connection wasn't the same. And then, I mean, you can have almost endless debates with anthropologists and geneticists. What are we doing as a species or a race? You know, all we're doing is passing on our genes, and that's what we're trying, you know. There's these kinds of arguments of why parents invest so much in their children. But it's not for economic reasons. You don't make money by having children. Okay, I'm sure I know. I have two myself, and I know the chuckles, what they sound like from people who have them, too. All right, so why? What, did slave owners, if it was profitable, apparently, to produce this age pattern of growth, did they respond to price signals in manipulating net nutrition? In other words, if the price of slaves went up, were they fed better or worked less? Okay, there are theoretical models that ponder this, I will not go into here. And you can't study this problem using adult heights. It's hard even using heights at a particular age because, remember, heights are a history of net nutrition. And so someone aged 10 years old has a 10-year history of net nutrition that's difficult to unravel and difficult to measure. What you really want is longitudinal data. Okay, let me explain. Here's 3 children, all born in 1830. This child is measured once in 1836. 6-year-old child measured in 1836. Okay, and this in yellow is also born in 1830 but measured once in 1835. Those are cross-sectional data, right? The bottom one shows a child born in 1830 measured in 1835 and again in 1836. So how much this child grew between 1835 and 1836 is going to reflect the nutritional conditions in that year, right? That's the virtue of longitudinal data. Now, we don't have true longitudinal data here. We have just cross-section, but we can mimic true longitudinal data as follows. If you subtract the height of the 5-year-old measured in 1835 from the height of the 6-year-old in 1836, you're going to get a quasi-longitudinal height, growth measure, right? They're born the same year, had the same influences on growth between 1830 and 1835, just one grew a year longer, okay? Of course, you're going to need large samples to play this game because genetic differences and so on and so forth. For genetic reasons, the older child could be shorter. Okay? But you get the idea. Think of it this way. Blue and yellow make green. Right? That's what we're doing. And there it is. That's the green. Those are velocity at ages 3 to 16 as a percent of average. So we're averaging from ages 3 to 16, we're averaging across boys and girls, and we're comparing how much they grew in each year at that age relative to what growth was across the whole time period, 1808 to 1861, and then just comparing it to average. So growth was high here in the early 1820s, and again in the late 30s and early 40s, high here, and a big spike in growth in the 1850s. So growth was quite irregular by this measure. The question is why? What was driving this pattern of variation in growth? It did vary a lot from year to year. Was it the price of slaves? Was it the price of food? Was it exposure to disease? And how can we measure those different things? Well, we can measure the price of pork. We know the price of slaves from historical records. And we can get a proxy, crude proxy for exposure to disease, particularly malaria, based on rainfall. And so this is, in a way, a double proxy. We don't have actual rainfall meteorological records for the South, but we have tree rings. Okay, and tree rings, the growth of vegetation, is a function of moisture. And when there's a lot of moisture, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a lot of malaria. Okay? So that's what we'll do. The Palmer Drought Severity Index, which is estimable from tree rings, and you would expect growth to be slower in wet years. Indeed, that's what you find. It's and faster in dry years, at least in the South. Now, on the plains that Eric referred to before, it's the opposite. Wet years are good for growth because moisture is scarce. And moisture isn't scarce in the South, especially in Atlanta last week. Okay? But you get the idea. There's plenty of moisture for crops and abundant, more than average moisture then results in more parasites, more mosquitoes that translate into malaria, which reduces growth. So that, in a nutshell, is where we're headed. We're almost there. There's the number of children measured at different ages. The sample is much bigger here than here, just on the number. So I have to use a statistical procedure called weighted regression. Some of you will know what that is. And in order to work with these data, that means it's more important in the statistical analysis if there are more observations. And here's some theories of plantation management. One extreme is automatic pilot. Plantation owners did what their parents did, who did what their grandparents did. It was fixed. Nothing changed. Okay. Well, it's unlikely, but possible. Then, at the other extreme, you could assume plantation owners were on the internet every day checking futures prices in Cincinnati and New York and adjusting the diet for lunch. Okay, that's absurd too, of course. But somewhere in between, maybe there's some truth. The question is, how persistent did changes have to be to get a response? And we'll see it takes a couple, 3 years. Okay. And so the idea put forward in this explanation by Rees, Kamlos, Long, and Wojtek, you can view this pattern of nutrition as reflecting efficiency wages. If slaves are more productive, they're fed more, or long-term investment. And so under this here, it's going to be the ratio of pork prices to cotton prices that are important, and here it's the ratio of slave prices to cotton prices that are important. Now the disease environment we're measuring by rainfall here. Okay, so what we have is here's the, the top, the blue is the price of slaves relative to the price of food. So if they get more valuable relative to food, the idea is they'd be fed better. And if price of cotton rises relative to the price of pork, you would have an effect on growth as well. But they're going in opposite directions here. Slave prices are generally rising, cotton prices are falling. And here's a slide on the malaria, the rainfall, and it shows malaria peaks soon after heavy rainfall. Okay, that's not a mystery for people who study malaria in tropical countries. That relationship is definitely there. We're just piggybacking on it. And that's the Palmer Drought Severity Index, 3-year moving average in red there. And what it shows, when the index is high, it's wet. Okay, so it was wet in the South in the 1820s and early 1830s, and then it got drier. Okay, and you'll find in the statistical analysis, when it got drier, slaves started to grow more. The children grew faster in those years. So there are the points for the Palmer Drought Severity Index that dendrochronologists have calculated. That's a huge field of study at Arizona and Columbia and a number of other places. So I took these points from which the Palmer Drought Index could be calculated. It's scaled from -6, super dry, Dust Bowl, to +6, super wet. Atlanta recently was at +6, okay? All right, and there's the regression, 2 more slides. So I don't know whether I'm getting too technical here, but the price of cotton relative to the price of pork doesn't matter. It's not, and I've played with specification a lot. They just don't get anything out of it. The efficiency wage argument doesn't work, but what does work is the price of slaves relative to the price of pork. And if slaves go up in value relative to the cost of food, they're better fed, is the idea, with a lag of 3 years. And that's a big effect. That coefficient of 0.6118 right here is a big bounce. And if you get rid of that variable, and in this specification, it's almost the same size. So the Palmer Index lagged 1 year. If it gets wetter, slaves grow less by 16 points, which is a pretty big effect. You know, remember the average is 100. So you're going up 16 or down 16 based on 1 point or the other. That's a lot of growth. So those are the two main drivers, weather and the prices of slaves and the prices of food, as expressed in the price of pork, which is the most expensive ingredient in the diet. So the conclusions then, these synthetic longitudinal heights are very useful. And any large data set of heights where you have children measured at different ages, you can do this, as long as they're still growing. It's a big step forward in methodology. Slave owners did respond. They were not automatic pilot. They didn't do the same thing year in, year out. They listened to market signals. When they're persistent, they made changes. They couldn't do anything about the weather, and that response is faster. It's a lag of 1 year. Okay? They couldn't respond. Okay? They were forced to adapt through disease. But for slave prices, it's very different. They could take their time adjusting to diets, adjusting workloads to what market signals were saying. Children were better off in health in the late antebellum period because the price of slaves went up, which is well known, and it got drier in the exporting areas for the slaves. So that's my story based on these vast collection of height data. The manifests, by the way, are the largest collection of heights of slave children in the world before probably the 1870s or the 1880s, when large numbers of school studies, the heights of school children were undertaken. It's really an amazing collection of evidence. I know I'm approached from time to time by genealogists, people who are doing black history. You know, can they trace their ancestors? Well, there are no last names here. See, that's the problem. And you have to presume maybe they took the name of the owner or shipper, but whether they were the owner at time of emancipation or not, you don't know. See, so I'm not sure you could do much with the names. But we have to take the records as they were written. That's all we can do. So, anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much.